Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. I'm Lynda Lopez. We wanted to start by saying I'm so excited. We are all so excited that there are so many young people who are here, engaged and interested in this 2016 election and in the political process. So we're super happy about that. And I wanted to start the day by asking you all a question, and it can be a show of hands. How many of you will be voting in November in the presidential election? Look at that, almost everybody. Awesome. Okay, so my next question is, how many of you know for sure that your best friend will also show up to vote in November? That's good, some hands went down, okay, that's good. And if you were to widen that out, if you're thinking about your friends, people in your classes, just people that you know, do you know for sure that people will be going in November to the polls to make sure they vote for the next president? All right, well, if it's kind of indicating what we know already if the past elections tell us anything. So in 2012, in the 2012 presidential election, 77% of young people did not show up to vote. So 7 in 10 of you will not go to the polls, is what we know from the past. 77%. And so we have one question for you, which is why? Why are you guys doing that? So we're going to try to find out a little bit today, and we're going to have a little conversation with our guests. So please help me welcome our guests. You're welcome. Oops. As I fix my mic here, let's talk a little bit about what issues are important to people, especially young people, and what would get everyone out to the polls. So our first guest is the senior political editor for CBS News, Steve Chaggaris.
Hello.
Welcome him. Thanks. And the political and field director for Rock the Vote, this is Sarah Audelo. And we have some of the audience members here who are some special guests too, but we'll tell you who they are just a little bit later. First, we're going to start our conversation with the big question. They say they're going out to vote. You saw all the hands. Why do young people generally not go out to the polls to vote for president?
You want to start?
Well, there's a few reasons here. When we talk about young people, we have to remember we're talking about a lot of first-time voters. And so those who have recently turned 18, I know we have a lot of 18-year-olds in the audience right now, which is really exciting. And so we need to make sure that we're reaching out early, that we have great civic education in schools so that young people are being targeted. They're asked that, hey, this is part of what we should be doing. Too frequently, that doesn't happen. And so we need to ask young people. Candidates need to go after their votes. They need to make sure they're registered. And that doesn't happen enough right now. That's why we at Rock the Vote exist and are trying to flip that script a bit.
Yeah, I wonder, we don't really have any hard evidence as to why they don't, but what we can point out is that generally young people don't go out to vote on a regular basis, presidential and especially midterm elections. We don't see a lot of young people out voting. And why is that? I don't know. Is that because there's this cycle of candidates not speaking to that generation, knowing that they're not going to go out and vote, and they speak to other issues that may be more relevant to older voters? Perhaps that's part of it. Perhaps that young people's lives are just so busy that, it's not part of, they don't feel that that's a major thing that they need to worry about every 2 years or 4 years. But what we do know is that sometimes you have candidates that do sort of catch on and resonate with younger voters, and you do see, like President Obama, for instance, in 2008, brought a lot more young people to the polls. We're seeing a little bit of that with Sanders this time around, at least in terms of people who are showing up to his events, although the evidence that's been coming in from the first few states of voting, not really larger numbers of younger voters. And so I wonder what that means overall. We don't really know yet what it means, but we do know that the numbers of, for instance, in South Carolina on Saturday, the turnout for 29 and under was 15% of overall turnout, of everybody that turned out, that's not a huge number. I think Obama got 20%, or 2008 there was 20% in South Carolina, so it was a lower percentage of the overall vote. And so why is that? I mean, Sanders is talking about issues that are resonating with young voters, but it didn't seem like young voters went out in droves in South Carolina to vote for him.
It's true, and I wonder if the reason could be, or one of the reasons could be, that when we pay attention to the news and when young people are paying attention and tuning in, are we hearing more about sort of the shock of the day comment or something that's, less substantive, and that's what people are tuning into? Or do young people care about the substantive stuff?
Yeah, young people absolutely care about substantive issues. I mean, if you ask them time and again, for example, we did a poll with USA Today recently, the #1 issue for them is the economy. And this is not new news. This is something that any poll that you look at about for young people, the economy is coming up. So I think it's a question of how are the candidates talking about this issue? Do they really understand what young people are going through with their high rates of unemployment, with their higher rates of poverty than previous generations the same age, with high rates of student debt? Like, our generation is struggling. We've struggled since the recession, and we're continuing to struggle. And so this, for us, we want to make sure that candidates are talking about these important issues so that we want to turn out for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and that's what you've seen Sanders sort of tap into, right? He's talking about all these economic issues, income inequality and college debt, and this is like really the pillar of his campaign. And I think that's why he's drawing so many young people to his events, and he's drawing so much support from them. I mean, you see that in the polling that he's done really, really well among young voters. But in terms of whether it's the news coverage, I don't know. I mean, you know, the reason why 18-year-olds got the right to vote was, I think people argued they were going out to fight in Vietnam,
Right.
and if they could go fight, then why shouldn't they be able to vote? And so then they lowered the voting age, and I think around that time, there was a lot more, you've seen the numbers, the percentage of young voters decrease ever since the early 70s.
Right.
It started in the late 70s after the war was over, and maybe, I don't know, this is just sort of anecdotal, but maybe young voters don't feel as connected to the issues in general. It
Right.
doesn't directly affect them as the Vietnam War did. Right, and the potential of a draft or going to serve and whatever.
And huge
so,
numbers.
Right, and so that number's just gone down every cycle since the late 70s.
That's true. And if we're talking about jobs and the economy being the #1 issue for young people, are the candidates who are running now, whether they're on the campaign trail or into the debates, are they talking about it in the way that younger people really care about, that millennials care about? Are they talking about just jobs, or are they talking about student loans? Are they talking about minimum wage? What are the things that they should be focusing on to engage people who are young and who will tune in and who will vote?
I mean, you hear a bit of those pieces here and there. I think one of the things that the millennial generation is huge, okay? And so we are certainly not a monolith. And so we're one of the most diverse generations that we've ever seen. But a lot of times when you talk about young people, people think, oh, you're a four-year college student. You know, it's someone who's between the ages of 18 and 22, living on a campus. That's a reality for some millennials, but certainly not the majority of them. Millennials had 80% of kids last year. So we're talking about millennials who are parents. We're talking about millennials who are in community college and working and parenting. So we have to make sure that we're not just have this like stereotype of what millennials are, but
Right.
really look at the breadth of diversity. When we're talking about unemployment, we should be talking about the higher rates of unemployment that Black youth face. When we're talking about poverty and student debt, we have to talk about those racial disparities there, which sometimes happens, but not frequently enough.
And again, I mentioned earlier, I wonder if it's this cycle of candidates not necessarily focusing on the issues that might be important to younger voters, but they look at the numbers. And in any given year, it's consistent that older voters vote in larger numbers than younger voters. And you had mentioned earlier that this year, the number of eligible voters, there'll be more millennials, right? That'll be eligible to vote than any other age
Than
group.
baby boomers,
Right.
yeah, which is
Than baby
amazing.
boomers.
Right.
So you got to let your voice be heard, right? Because otherwise, if politicians don't see those numbers coming up in terms of turnout, they're not going to speak to them. And so I'll use South Carolina as an example. The South Carolina Democratic primary, which is just on Saturday, 65% of the turnout were people age 45 and over.
Right.
So if you're running for office, you're going to speak to the 65% of the people who are turning out, right?
Right. But don't they also, the candidates, as Sarah was pointing out, have a responsibility to talk about the minimum wage, if that's important to young people, or talk about student debt, you know, student loan debt, which is crushing. That's one thing we
Right.
do hear Bernie Sanders talk a lot
Right,
about.
but
when
how
he
is that
travels
working
around.
out for Bernie Sanders, right? He got
Right.
25% of the vote in South Carolina. Again, so the point is it's this cycle of, if politicians can speak about these issues and they can attract younger voters, but if younger voters aren't going to go and vote, they're looking at it as, what is the point? We're going to target the people who we know are going to actually go to the polls and pull the lever.
So in case you're all getting the message that Steve is trying to get across to you guys, that's why we call it Make It Count.
You know, there's
But, yeah.
limited amounts of money that these candidates
Right.
have to spend, and they have to target the people who they know are going to go vote. And
Right.
every 2 years, at least with federal elections, it is older voters that come out to vote.
That's true.
Especially the oldest voters.
It's true, right. But we have the numbers within the young generation, within millennials and 18 to 34-year-olds. And as you were saying, we know that they're the most multicultural generation so far. So there are issues that have to do with race, with policing practices, and there are movements like Black Lives Matter. Are candidates paying enough attention to that to fire up young voters and to mobilize young voters?
You know, some are, but many are not, and they're not doing, again, not doing it enough. Because when we look at the issues that young people face, and a lot of people will throw out stereotypes, oh, they're disengaged, they don't care, et cetera, et cetera. Young people have always been leading social justice movements.
Right.
And so right now, of course, we see that with Black Lives Matter, but we also see that with undocumented young people and their allies who are standing with them to force the candidates to talk about immigration. So young people have been there. It's just a matter of are others paying attention or not. And as it relates to candidates reaching out, are candidates also in their campaigns registering young people? Because again, we have this big registration gap here. We have a generation who many are just turning 18. They're first-time voters. So it's not just, hey, young people, turn out to the polls. It's, hey, young people, are you registered? Let's make sure you're getting registered so then we can make that next step to turning out the polls.
I also want to point out, this isn't like targeting millennials and saying, oh, millennials just don't go vote. This is an issue that has been an issue for generation after generation. Younger people just aren't as engaged for some reason. But as they get older, they get more engaged. And so these issues that you bring up, it's going to be fascinating. So if they're not issues that are going to be talked about at the presidential level in a general election this year, they will have to be talked about at some point because this generation is interested in those issues. And while they might not be as engaged this time around, they will be much more engaged as they get older. And they're not going to stop paying attention to those issues.
Right.
It's going to be a much more multicultural generation. It's going to be interesting to see the shift and how candidates deal with these issues. Maybe not this year,
Right.
but maybe 4 years from now or 8 years from now. It's going to be fascinating to watch that.
I love it. Well, what has Rock the Vote learned about how you get people registered and involved and then actually showing up at the polls on election day?
So there's a few things. One, you have to go where young people are. So for example, when I talk about registering the 17 and 18-year-olds, like many of whom are here, we have a curriculum called Democracy Class that we give away for free, essentially. So teachers can teach young people about the history of voting, and then there's a registration component at the end. We're actually going to be celebrating what we have deemed Democracy Day on March 23rd, which is the anniversary of, at least it passing in Congress, young people, 18-year-olds being able to vote. And so that is one of the big things that we're doing to reach young people in the schools. And we welcome teachers and educators and young people to go to our website, rockthevote.com, to get this taught in your classrooms. I think the other thing we do is we need to make sure that, yes, we're looking at young people in college campuses, but those that are outside college campuses. So one of our newest initiatives is a corporate civic responsibility program where we're reaching out to corporations that have a lot of millennials on staff or have a large following of millennials online. So looking at companies like iHeartRadio and Nielsen and Twitter and Tinder to make sure that when they are pushing out their messages online, there's a civic engagement component to that because we need to meet, again, we have to reach young people where they are and we have to be really authentic with our messaging. DC, as much as I love the city and live there, it's kind of a mess right now. And so we need to make sure that young people are also they want to see candidates that are speaking authentically to them. And I think one of the missed opportunities that we have, and a lot of youth organizations are doing a great job at this right now, is looking at all the other races that are happening this year. So we've got governor's races, we have mayor's races. Each of these different levels of government absolutely impact young people's daily lives. And when we talk about student debt, state legislators are the ones who are putting money in to decide how much tuition is going to cost at our public colleges and universities. So if we really care about the cost of higher ed, we should be looking at state legislator races too.
Right. You have to do your midterm elections, your presidential elections.
Yeah, we have to look all the way down the ballot.
To her point, though, we were talking about this before. I think it's really interesting. There's this mindset that, well, we got to find millennials to talk to millennials in order to get them engaged.
Right.
And then we have Bernie Sanders, who's 74 years old, who is resonating among younger voters, right? And I think what that proves is it goes against every marketer's idea that you have to have young people speaking to young people. You just have to have a message that resonates with young people. It doesn't matter what age you are. And I think people who are older are misunderstanding that, right? So maybe, there's a lesson to be learned from Sanders by other candidates. It doesn't matter if you're a 60-year-old candidate or a 74-year-old candidate or a 29-year-old candidate. You can still speak to all generations if you have the right message.
And we've heard that about young people a lot, that authenticity is really important. If they know that you're true, if they know that you're sincere and that your message is authentic, that's what's going to get through. And it doesn't matter if you're 74 years old. You don't need an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old to tell you that. I love that. Okay, so in the Rock the Vote USA Today poll that you were just talking about a little while ago, one really interesting thing stood out to me, which is that the younger generation now, or young people, if we're talking 18 to 34, have generally reached a consensus over some issues that were way more divisive to older people or to older generations. So I wanted to ask you about one or two of those to see if that was the case. When it comes to the environment, for example, green issues, which we don't hear a lot about in this election from candidates. Is that something that is more of a consensus if you're talking among younger people?
Absolutely. I mean, I think climate and clean energy is one of those issues where young people are definitely more on the progressive side of the spectrum than older generations. Another stat that came up in that poll was young people want background checks for purchasing guns. That is, although we also see that in older generations too, there's pretty much consensus with the generation there. So, you know, this is, I think, another missed opportunity from those who are running to really reach out to young people because they're experiencing these issues every day. You know, we've worked with young people in Chicago before who were fighting against gun violence in their communities every single day. Gun violence is a massive issue for them. But how are the candidates talking about it? A little bit here and there. Again, not enough.
I mean, I think what it speaks to, though, is those issues don't rise to the level of top issues for anybody, whether it's for millennials or any generation. You look at economy and foreign policy tend to be the
Right.
top. But those issues are big issues within the primaries. And so among Democratic candidates, environment's a huge thing. And you'll hear both Clinton and Sanders talking about the environment, guns as well,
Right.
and guns on the other side, too, on a completely different viewpoint. Big issue with Republicans. But I think in a general election situation, those issues don't tend to rise unless there's some major story to sort of bring that to the forefront. If there's a mass
Right.
shooting, then everybody starts talking about the gun issue, and then it becomes, temporarily, it becomes a major issue for voters. But ultimately, they don't last as sort of major issues for people.
Well, and I think there's a missed opportunity, too, to look at how these issues intersect with the economy, for example.
Right.
So, you know, when we're talking about young people and high rates of underemployment, where does green jobs fall into that conversation? Many green jobs of which pay much better than other jobs. Young people at the end of the day want to be able to support themselves and their families. And that's what we need candidates to recognize is that
Right.
there are many issues that young people care about. But if I can't pay my bills, if I'm worried about getting kicked out of my house, or if I'm still living with my parents,
Right.
like those are some things that I
Can't pay
want to
my
get
student
figured
loans,
out.
can't get any of those things done.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's huge. So is there another consensus issue when it comes to LGBT rights or transgender rights or just universal acceptance? Is that something that makes them different from previous generations also?
Absolutely. Young people have led on this issue for years at this point, whether it was marriage first, and now if we look at some of the broader fights for larger equality, whether it's related to non-discrimination in housing or employment, for example. Whether you are urban or rural, no matter what your race is, your education level, young people in general, they see their LGBTQ peers and they don't see any reason why they should be treated differently. So LGBT rights is definitely one of those issues where the generation is leading.
Yeah, and I mean, you've actually seen that. I mean, Republicans normally are strongly against those kinds of issues. When the Supreme Court ruled, you saw some Republicans basically say, okay, the Supreme Court ruled, that's the law of the
Right.
land now, and moving on, right? There's
Right.
less resistance from some. And so I think it's not just a generational thing. I think there's a reality that in this country, these issues
Right.
there's been a transformation.
But that has something to do, as you pointed out, with the fact that young people sort of lead the charge on all new
Absolutely.
issues and all new movements.
Well,
that get them
and on
moving
LGBT
forward.
rights, like we have more young people who identify as LGBTQ than previous generations as
Right.
well, right? So we have more folks who are out, more folks who are open about their identity, and that certainly helps to move the generation along, right? When you're talking about your friends, your family members who are out, and again, like why the idea that someone would be able to get kicked out of their housing or fired because of who they are, it just is mind-blowing.
Right, that's amazing. But you made the point before that even though we can see some consensus among a lot of things in high numbers, you can't lump this generation, or you can't lump young people in general into one monolith, and they're going to do this, or they'll vote this way. There's no one-size-fits-all argument for
Yeah,
them, so.
absolutely. I mean, in our poll that we had come out, you know, young people, we see them skew a bit more progressive when you ask them about specific issues, but when you ask about identity, more young people identify as economically conservative, for example. More of them identify as more conservative on foreign policy. Even when you dig a little bit deeper, that may not be the case when you get very specific. So for us, we're like, this is an opening. This is an opening for candidates on both sides of the aisle to really reach out to the generation and have these conversations with them and start trying to make sure their messages are fitting and their actions are fitting what young people are looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if that happens. Like I said,
Right.
there's such a limited amount of resources that these candidates have, and so they're looking at where's the low-hanging fruit. You know,
Right.
who's going to be out there to vote, and you know, it's every 2-4 years. It's not just this generation. It just seems to be an issue year after year, and you know, until a generation, whether it's millennials or the next young generation, gets out there and starts voting in larger numbers, I think you're going to see politicians really focus on the people who do go out and vote.
Well, and to the point of not being able to count on sort of a group of people to move as one, we have a woman running for president, a candidate who's doing very well and moving very strongly, and you don't know that you can count on young women specifically, in general, mobilizing to vote for a woman because she is a woman. So Hillary Clinton, can she count on millennial support? Because when we look at young people in general, it doesn't seem like that would be the case.
I mean, right now, I think when we look at Hillary Clinton, we're looking right now at the Democratic ticket, right?
Right.
And that's what that's happening right now. If you look, of course, the first couple primaries and caucuses, Bernie Sanders won that by a lot. In South Carolina, that gap was a lot more narrow. So it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. I think the other thing that we're kind of missing here, though, too, is that we're seeing record turnout for young Republicans. And so a lot of the narrative is very focused on Bernie and Hillary. But I think the other piece is that we've had record-breaking young Republican turnout in every primary or caucus.
Right.
And so there's certainly a lot of discussion on the Democratic side, but I think we're missing some of what's moving right now on the Republican side, too.
But what about young women, Steve? Do you think that they're coming out for Hillary Clinton or
Well,
mostly
they haven't so far. I mean, I guess South Carolina is a different story, but in the first few, they hadn't. And, you know, that's a concern for her, obviously, as the first potential woman president. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is a primary, right? So they have choices. They have a choice between Bernie Sanders, who is speaking to issues that are much more attractive to younger voters than Hillary Clinton is. Again, that's the pillar of his campaign, is talking about these economic issues, college debt, all that. But if he's not in the race anymore and she's the nominee, where are these people going to go?
Right.
Are they not going to vote, or are they going to vote for Hillary Clinton? I would think that young women would eventually flock to Hillary Clinton, young female Democrats.
Right.
Maybe they don't. Maybe they just don't vote. But they're not going to vote for the Republican, likely. Right now, they're voting for Sanders because I think they like his message better. But when he's not there, we'll see what happens.
Well, I want to let you know, introduce you to a couple of people that we have here on stage because we can ask them directly about these exact questions. And we actually have some high school students up here who went to New Hampshire right before the New Hampshire primary, and they worked in New Hampshire on different campaigns. Some of them volunteered for different candidates and did actual field work in the streets. So Heather, who's right back here, Heather actually volunteered for Hillary Clinton. So I wanted to ask why she was your pick for a candidate.
I chose Hillary because I think she's definitely a little bit more realistic than Bernie. I think Bernie is a great candidate, but I don't think his policies would actually pass through a Republican Congress. And I think she has a lot of experience and she would be willing to compromise when needed.
That's great. What was the experience like of going out to volunteer for her, sort of knocking on doors?
It was so amazing, like especially going to her rallies and being with people that were so passionate about Hillary and seeing her talk and like seeing she's actually a real person was just so cool.
Did you get to meet the candidate?
Yeah, I did actually.
And what was that like?
It was kind of surreal, especially seeing her walk out on stage for the first time and then getting to take a picture with her, which was all I got because everyone wanted a picture with Hillary.
Yeah, that's great.
But it was so cool.
That's so great. We also have some other volunteers here. We have Harrison, who's right over here. I need you to get a microphone as well. Harrison volunteered for the Marco Rubio campaign, so he's a Marco Rubio supporter. Why did you pick Marco Rubio?
Well, like Heather, I also agree with Marco Rubio's policies. I think that he has a strong stance on abortion, and I agree with, unlike the other Republican candidates, he thinks that through like intensive background checks on immigrants, people should be allowed, the Syrian refugees should be allowed, and most of the other Republican candidates really don't think that. They think that they should all just they shouldn't be allowed into our country, and I think he's more right of center than most of the other candidates. I think that a Cruz wouldn't have that much legislation passed because he wouldn't be willing to compromise.
Kind of like a Bernie Sanders.
Just
almost.
like Bernie Sanders, yeah.
Okay. By the way, you guys, if you have questions for these young people, please jump in if you want to. But so what was the experience like for you to go out and volunteer?
The experience was really cool. New Hampshire's unlike many other states where it's retail politics, where the candidates really get a chance to meet every single person that wants to meet them. You have chances to go to rallies. You have chances to introduce yourself to the candidate, maybe even ask a question, because they stay at the end of the rallies to have a conversation with you and take a picture, which I think is very unlike almost all the other states in the country.
Right.
And it was interesting walking around New Hampshire. We were phone banking and we were also knocking on doors. And I thought knocking on doors was really cool. Getting a chance to speak to voters in New Hampshire and hearing their opinions on policies. I mean, like, I think that through this course that we take this year, maybe even like 60% of my political socialization has occurred. I feel like I've really learned a lot about myself as a politician and how I feel on certain views, and I think it's just really interesting.
So have you been paying attention to Rubio in the last week or so, and
Yeah.
this sort of strategy shift where he's really gone after Trump, a lot of insults flying back and forth? I just wonder, as somebody who's followed Rubio and as a supporter of Rubio, what is your take on that strategy shift? Do you like the fact that he's gone after Trump? Do you like the way he's gone after Trump? Do you think that this will help him moving forward?
Well, I think that when Christie attacked him during the debate in New Hampshire, I think at that point he was being too passive. I think that, like John Kasich, he was kind of just letting it, like, he wasn't trying to attack other people. I think he thought it was smarter to stay back. But when Christie attacked him, he realized that going on attack really has a significant impact because his polling numbers dropped significantly when he became attacked. So I think he feels that if he attacks Trump, maybe he can have the same impact on Trump that Christie did on him. And I think it's smart on his part.
What about the kinds of attacks? It seems like he's getting a lot of attention for the insults and not
Are
necessarily
you okay with the fact that it's sort of much
substantive
more negative now?
Right, the
and-
substantive stuff.
Personally, I think the way Kasich is campaigning, I think that's the way politics should be. I feel like it should be more about the issues and less about attacking each other. But Trump, if you fact check Trump on the things he says during the debates, a lot of what he says isn't true. And I think that the fact that Rubio and Cruz are starting to point out the fact that he's really blundering the truth it's smart on his part, because the Trump supporters are like, they take a moment to realize, and I really think it's smart on Rubio's part. I think being passive wasn't working for him as much as it will be for when he's aggressive and attacking Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a question that I would have for all of you guys up here, which is that there's kind of a negative tint, especially on the Republican side now, to the way everyone's been talking and the rhetoric and the attacks that have been going back and forth. And how do you guys feel about that as being part of the campaign rhetoric?
Yeah, so I'm also a Rubio fan. And the reality of the race is that Trump has sort of transformed the way that we politically communicate. I mean, he just takes to Twitter and goes all out. He uses very childish insults. And, Rubio, for most of the race, has been very substantive. He's had specific policy proposals on foreign policy, on, wage stagnation, on all of these different issues. But now I feel like he sort of has to take the gloves off and almost sink to Trump's level in order to beat him. Maybe by the general election, he'll go back to substance, but the only way you can take down Trump is by, going into the sandbox with him, unfortunately.
And I think this is an interesting thing that we're seeing right now with young people, because if you look at a lot of the exit polls from the previous primaries and caucuses, Trump has not been the #1 candidate for young people. It's gone back and forth between Cruz and Rubio.
Right.
And so I think we're seeing that a little bit here from the folks here in the audience about their own experiences and maybe what they're looking for in a candidate.
That's true. And we don't have a lot of time left, so I wanted to make sure that we got to any questions that we have that are out here. And I'm going to have to steal the microphone from one of you guys. But do you mind bringing it out, actually?
Sure.
So you can come up to this side if you had any questions. Thanks, Jonathan. If anyone had any questions for Steve or for Sarah or just in general for your peers up here to see. No one? Over
We've
here.
answered every
We've
question. It's
answered
amazing.
every single question that young people could
Awesome.
have. All right.
Well, I think maybe until you get a question, something I want to highlight,
Oh,
which is
here we go.
so rad,
Oh,
is
yeah,
these
come-
young people participating in campaigns. And I think that's something, as we look at voters, we need to have more programs for young people to be able to participate. I love it was part of their curriculum and their ability to go for class credit, right? Is that what y'all said? So we need much more of this in the future.
So, do we have? Yep, come on up.
Oh, I'm coming up? Okay.
Well, you can come right here. You can come to the front so we can see you.
Hi. I'm Talia. I also go to their school. I was just wondering if you could, predict what do you think is going to happen with the election? Because I know right now, Trump's going. I know it's a.
That's what we're asking
hard
you
question,
guys.
Okay. But I don't know. I was just wondering what you think, because I think there's a lot of speculation with like if Trump's going to go all the way or not, because 3 months ago people didn't see this happening. But I don't know. What's your opinion?
Actually, a really good question. What are you guys' thoughts?
I mean, I Rock the Vote, we are a nonpartisan organization. We work with people across the aisle. And so for us, like, our passion is making sure that young people are voting and that candidates are talking about the issues that are important for them.
Well, Steve's been on the campaign trail, and he's been kind of covering a lot of the candidates, so.
I don't
what
do
you think of-
predictions, though.
What do you think of the momentum?
Well, I can tell you this. I can tell you last year at this time, we were all bracing for a Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton race.
Right.
That clearly is not happening. I don't think anybody predicted that Sanders would resonate as much as he has. But I think that Saturday's results in South Carolina might be a precursor to what's going to happen tomorrow on Super Tuesday. And if that turns out to be the case, I think it's going to be hard to stop Hillary Clinton after tomorrow. And on the Republican side, it's the same thing. I don't think there was anybody that thought that that Trump would have won 3 out of the first 4 handily. And then on the one that he lost, only lost by 4 points. And I think that the strength that he has shown, the broad strength he has shown among all various demographics is just sort of fascinating to watch. And he's done it in different parts of the country. He's done it in the Midwest. He's done it in the Northeast. He's done it in South Carolina. He's done it in the West. And so we hit tomorrow, and he's expected to do very well. And I think if that storyline plays out, it's going to be really hard for somebody like Cruz or Rubio or Kasich or Ben Carson to try to change the game. And I think you listen to a lot of Republicans who don't want to see Trump as the nominee, and they're talking about delegate count, and they're talking about how can we do a contested convention, and it's really not about beating Trump. It's about what are the other avenues that we have, very, very narrow avenues. So, I mean, not to make any predictions, because anything can happen. I think we'll have a better sense after tomorrow. But it is looking like, you know, Trump is rolling and Clinton's rolling. Well, I guess we'll see after tomorrow if that's the case.
Thank you so much. So then, just as a final thought, why is it so important that young people turn out, that they get to the polls and they make sure they show up for these elections?
Well, because we have the power. You know, we're going to be 1/3 of the electorate. We have more of the electorate than the baby boomer generation, as y'all opened up the panel with. And so for us, that's why we're like working so hard to make sure that young people are registered, they're turning out. We're working with partners across the country, across the political spectrum, because this is our moment. This is like such an epic opportunity to make sure that the issues that we care about are being raised.
I mean, I guess my final point is, you know, we've just sort of in historically, at least recent history, anytime a candidate has said, okay, my base is young voters, everybody then writes that candidate off, because it turns out that that's not enough to get you elected, whether it's Howard Dean in 2004 or Rand Paul even this year or Bernie Sanders. It just seems like that's not the thing. And so, you know, it's really up to younger voters to have a louder voice if they want to really create change in politics. It's clear that they care about politics. We see these polls, and young people are very engaged. It's just, in terms of turnout, it doesn't exist. And I think that winds up creating the cycle of where politicians don't speak to them, and then it's just this sort of, you know, that's what we get every cycle. So it's really incumbent upon young people to get out there and show politicians that they are this voice. They're not just numbers, but they actually come out in numbers and vote.
That's right. And that's why we think having these conversations in the first place is important, and broadcasting them and bringing them to a bigger level, because that's what we believe, especially here at WCBS News Radio, that your vote is your voice, and you have to make it count. So I want to thank you guys. Thank you all for being here today and joining us.